G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and a totally different episode for you today. I want to talk a little bit about Total War, and I want to talk about a Total War game that I would really like to see. It'll probably never happen, but it would be a really fun concept. So my concept is a Total War game that's set in the Fertile Crescent. That's basically all the green you're seeing on the map. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers and down to the Nile Delta. And it would be set around 1200 BC, funny enough. I think that's a brilliant setting for a Total War game that's not just retreading the exact same ground that all the other Total War games have, because this is one period of history that is really not delved into. When people think of classical or ancient history, yeah, people know Egypt, people know Babylon, people know, say, Persians, and they think of, say, classical Greece and the Greco-Persian Wars, or ancient Macedon, or ancient Rome, of course. Maybe they think of some of Alexander's successors, like the Seleucids and a few others along the way, Ptolemaic Egypt, for example. That's all interesting, but there's this whole other era, this whole other period of history that predates all of that by 500 to 1,000 years. And that's really well worth exploring, because there's a lot of major empires that grow up in that part of the world, which would make for a really fun game. So I'll walk you through each of these civilizations, give a quick rundown of who's who in the players. So first off, Egypt. Capital will be Memphis. Right there, little target on the bottom left. So Egypt, in that time period, very much a expanding power. New Kingdom Egypt especially wants to expand, push up into the Levant, and then they're going to come into contact with another of the big players, and that is the Hittites. So Hattusa, which is up the top there on the map, that is the capital city of the Hittites. So the two empires, Egypt and the Hittites, they actually have a big battle around Megiddo, and I believe it's the first ever recorded peace treaty that actually gets signed is between these two nations, these two empires in that part of the world due to their constant conflict. Moving over to the right of there, or to the east, we get to, obviously, Babylon. So Babylon, very, very ancient, famous city, a huge power. Many of these empires rose 2 or 3 times. They would have a big rise, then they would be crushed by some neighbor, then they would come back bigger and better. And this happened multiple times with Babylon. North of there, we have Assyria. The ancient Assyrians are really interesting as a people. They were probably the most brutal subjugators in human history, so that should tell you a lot. These guys would make the Mongols blush, because they were just brutal. And of course, the Assyrians were one of the earliest empires to conquer pretty much the entire Middle East. They even conquered all the way into Egypt at one point. So if you move away from the Assyrian capital at Nineveh, it could be Assur, but Nineveh is more recognised, I'll say, historically. It was more of a second city that became a first city. You get over to the Medes and Ecbatana. And of course, below that, we have the Elamites and Susa. So the Elamites, I guess, would be taken over by the Persians later on, under Darius. That's much further down the line. And actually, technically under Cyrus. Cyrus the Great is the one who really founds the Persian Empire, I should clarify. Of course, west of the Assyrians, you're going to run into the Mitanni. Wasukani is going to be their capital. So, obviously, several of these factions are going to bump headlong into each other really early on in the game. And the last sort of major players here, well, we've got Phoenicia, of course, the famous sailors, the Phoenicians. They'll be located in Tyre, right on the Levant coast there. Up north, you're going to have Lydia on the far left, and their capital is Sardis, and Phrygia, which will be the centremost of those. So they're going to have a hard time, Phrygia, being sandwiched in between basically the Hittites and Lydia. But of course, because of their location on the map and the mountainous terrain and such, they'll actually be kind of insulated. Not to mention those other nations are going to have their own problems to worry about because, well, Egypt is going to be pushing hard towards Phoenicia, and there are many kingdoms along the way there that I haven't even sort of spoken about. We have Eliasha in Cyprus, we have the Jews in the Levant, we have Kassites in Babylonia, you've got all these big city-states like Uruk, Assur, Aleppo, Damascus, Thebes. Very interesting areas for gameplay potentially there. On top of that, you also have an interesting late-game crisis available, historical one. So those who've played Total War over the years would know that many games have a late-game crisis, and that is something that happens that, okay, you've basically conquered the map, you are winning the game, we're going to throw a spanner in the works with a real-life event. Thrones of Britannia, you get the Norman conquest of England, or you get Viking raids. When you have, say, Rome, for example, Attila mod, you get the Huns. If you have medieval, you get the Mongols, okay? These are all endgame events. And of course, some, like Total Warhammer, they just make up a late game event for the sake of the game. Well, here we actually have a major late game event that's a real life thing, and that is the Bronze Age collapse. So not everyone in the audience will be familiar with this, but the Bronze Age collapse was essentially the entire Mediterranean and near Middle Eastern empires just all collapsed basically overnight. We're not sure why it is. There's sort of 4 ongoing hypotheses, basically down to the collapse of the bronze trade, foreign invasion, internal disputes, drought, a whole bunch of different factors. But you could use the Sea Peoples, or the famous sort of raiders. It was believed that the Sea Peoples were these raiders that came out of Greece and Italy and would sail in, raid a city, sack it, kill all the inhabitants, take all their stuff, and then piss off again. Well, that would be a really interesting sect of people to introduce in as your late game crisis here for your Bronze Age collapse. And that crisis obviously allowed certain kingdoms to grow because it collapsed the Hittite Empire entirely. It destroyed, I think, Mycenaean Greece. The Minoans had disappeared by that point, and Egypt survived it, but basically collapsed. I think it was Ramses III, I'm going to say, beat them at the Battle of the Nile Delta. And that sort of put an end to the Sea People's major raiding, and he commemorated it, but it was too late for the empire by that point. And this is what gave other empires, like the Neo-Assyrians, time to rise up and have their moment in the sun that they might not have otherwise gotten, being sandwiched between such great empires, which were powerful in their heyday. So really interesting scope for what could be done here, I think, for a Total War game. And of course, we don't get that, unfortunately, in many Total War games these days. They've gone much more commercialized, much easier to digest. I've been playing since Medieval 2 days, which I think that's the one that got most people. I've got Medieval 2, I've got Shogun 2, didn't get Empire. I've got Rome 2, Attila 2, Attila 2, Attila as well, I should say. Of course, Total Warhammer 1, 2, and 3, Thrones of Britannia. So, I'm all in on the Total War front. And this is something I'd like to see. Also because the warfare of the period is quite different to what would come after. When people think of the classical ancient world, well, again, you think Roman legions, you think Greek phalanxes. Well, this is a time period 500 to 1,000 years before any of that. It's going to be 500 years before classical Greece. It's going to be 1,000 years before the Roman Empire is really kicking off. More than, in fact. It's going to be over 1,000 years between this and the Punic Wars. And in this time period, you see crazy, heavily armoured warriors, like just these gigantic bronze suits of armour. On top of that, you're also going to see chariot warfare. Chariots are king in this era. And the other king in this era is archers, just massed archers. So this is when you're first seeing like actual militaries being organized for the first time in history for long campaigns where they're not going to go home for harvest season to harvest their crops. These armies are professional, they're maintained in the field, and they are out there long term. That's how Assyria is so successful. Part of why is that professional standing army in the battlefield. The Egyptians use these light chariots with archers in the back. The Hittites are going to use these real heavy chariots with heavily armoured warriors in them. They're basically acting like a battlefield taxi. There's an awful lot of stuff going on there. That could provide some really fun and unique gameplay. Yes, of course, there's big blobs of spearmen, and, well, you don't have swordsmen in this era. Swords are using quite a lot of precious rare metal, but you will see lots of spearmen, and you will see men with, say, axes or clubs or, whatever weapon they can find. But spear's definitely a predominant weapon. And, of course, archers, bows. Countries like Egypt will have these things, but because of the much more limited access to wood, they're going to try and get wood out of somewhere like the Levant. They're going to move into Syria and Palestine and that part of the world to try and get timber so they can use it in construction, in ships, in military assets, because they can't grow a lot of timber at home. Egypt, funny enough, is not known for its ranging forests. So, interesting thing there. Of course, Babylon. Babylon is a trade hub. It's sort of in the center, collecting, everything from all these other cities surrounding it. They've got the vicious Assyrian neighbors to the north, but also they're dealing with steppe horsemen in the northeast, over in whether it's the Medes or whether it's going to be the Elamites, and of course later the Persians. With Phoenicia, they're right on the shore there, and they're sandwiched between these big nations, but there's a bit of distance there. A bit of distance can be protection for them, because some of their neighbours are going to have to worry about each other first, and Egypt is not going to necessarily hit Phoenicia straight away, because they've got to go through so many other smaller city-states to get there. So I think Phoenicia would be wise to expand out into the Mediterranean there and try and take something like Cyprus, take on the kingdom of Alatia, or Alashia, I should say. I'm not very good at pronunciation of my ancient Middle Eastern names, but give me a break, guys. So yeah, that's what I would like to see in a Total War game from this period. There's a lot of interesting cultures, all different as well, with different styles of warfare in this time period, and very famous nations that many would have heard of and haven't really explored. And, well, to be honest, video games just don't explore this stuff. Video games always seem to have a hard cut-off of ancient Greece, and it's just anything further back than that is a no. They just won't touch it. Whereas I think this 1000 BC era, it's gold to be mined here. Whether it's we've seen it with, say, Three Kingdoms over in China, and we've had Shogun 1 and 2 in feudal Japan, and we had the Fall of the Samurai and the Rise of the Samurai, both expansions to that initial Shogun 2, which was literally the formation of feudal Japan, and the end of that as it modernized and westernized. You could do something similar here. You could expand this map to include, say, the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of classical Greece. Or you could go east and include, say, is it maybe Gupta? I'm not super crash hot on my Indian history, but obviously the Bactria, or what would become Bactria, and India, and that part of the world could also be included into the game. Sure, why not? There's a lot that you could do here, so I would like to see it explored, because this is the cradle of civilization, and no game, like major mainstream game, has really tackled this particular region of the world. The only one that sort of comes close as like a major release in my lifetime, I think, is probably Age of Empires 1. And even then, that's a very shallow rendition of what it is, and everyone uses the same stuff anyway. There's no unique roster really in Age of Empires 1. So to see a Total War game that actually explores this and the different kingdoms and what could be done with this part of the world, I mean, even this map isn't accurate. Like, I got the locations of these cities very accurate on the map, but this is the modern day map of the world. If you go back to when all this was happening, it's radically different, believe it or not, to this. For example, the Persian Gulf is nowhere near that small. It's actually much larger because it's slowly being filled up by erosion from all these rivers washing soil out into it constantly over, it's been 3,500 years. since when this map would begin, when the game would take place, several hundred years before the Bronze Age collapse. Anyway, that's it from me. I've rambled on enough. Back with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and if you're into Total War or something like that, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Do you think this would be a great game, or do you just want them to make a Rome 3 or a Medieval 3 or a Shogun 3, or, retreading the same ground? I'd probably like an Empire 2, if I'm honest. I never bought Empire, but that's because it was crap and I read the reviews. But I wanted it to be good. I do enjoy that kind of game. But, yeah. Anyway, let me know what you think below.